In the 1950s and 1960s, John Lewis was a pioneer in the civil rights movement. Today, he's a U.S. congressman fighting for the same rights. We talk today about the Jena 6, today's civil rights movement, and the war in Iraq and how they all affect each other. So, Congressman, I wanted to talk at first about a little bit of your background. How did you get into the civil rights movement to begin with?
I grew up in rural Alabama, about 50 miles south of Montgomery. Growing up there, I saw segregation and racial discrimination. Had seen those signs that said white men, white women, white waiting, colored waiting. And I would come home and ask my mother, my father, my grandparents, my great-grandparents, why segregation, why racial discrimination? They would say, that's the way it is. Don't get in the way, don't get in trouble. But one day I heard about Rosa Parks, and I heard the words of Martin Luther King Jr., and the words of Dr. King inspired me. Seemed like he was saying, John Lewis, you too can become involved. You can make a difference.
How do you go from a radical organization like SNCC into the Congress? It seems like the Congress is obviously quite a bit more conservative than SNCC was, and how do you make that transition? Is that difficult for you to do?
It is not that difficult to go from being part of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, being part of the overall civil rights movement, and being in the Congress. I see my involvement in Congress playing a role in an elected body as an extension of my involvement in the civil rights movement. We were fighting to be able to participate in the democratic process. When I was growing up, my own mother and father, my grandparents, my great-grandparents could not register to vote. I could not register to vote in the state of Alabama when I was growing up, when I became of age, because people were denied the right to vote simply because of the color of their skin. It was a radical thing to even talk about registering to vote or running for an office.
With your work, your background in voting rights, it seems like a lot of the things that are happening in Atlanta with the laws on voting rights are in violation of the voting rights bills that have come through Congress. Are you worried about that?
I'm deeply worried, I'm deeply concerned about what is happening in Atlanta, in Georgia, and so many other parts of our country. They attempt to take us back when you have the photo ID as a requirement for people to be able to cast a vote. It's a modern day poll tax because people have to pay for an ID.
We're seeing a resurgence in the civil rights movement today, largely because of what's happening with the Jena 6. What's your opinion on that?
It is gratifying and very moving to see so many young people speaking up and speaking out, at least getting in motion or getting in the way and responding to some of the issues and problems that we're confronting today, such as the Jena 6. I think it's a good thing to see this new wave of activism on the part of a large segment of the society.
With Jena 6 and all this resurgence in the civil rights movement, what's happening on the Hill for it?
Well, here on the Hill, many members of Congress are preoccupied with issues dealing with the appropriation bill, dealing with the war in Iraq. There's so many prevailing issues that hidden members of Congress. And people are concerned about hate crime. They're concerned about finding a way to end the war in Iraq and try to prevent the administration from going into Iran. But as a Congress, I don't think we're doing as much as we should be doing to pass legislation, since the Congress resolution, when it comes to some of our domestic problems. The war is sort of preoccupy everything that we do.
Since you bring up the war, I'd like to talk about that for a second and ask where you stand on the supplementals that are coming, the funding of the war, There's a recent ABC Washington Post poll that said that 51% of Americans are in favor of cutting off funding for the war. Well over 70% now are against the war. Where do you sit on the war in Iraq?
Well, if it were left up to me, I would not vote for another dime, another penny to support this war. So I'm for cutting off funding. I'm for ending the war and ending it now. Even if there's timetables and things like that attached to the supplementals, would you vote against funding? I would vote against funding. It's no way, in all good conscience, I cannot and will not vote for another penny to support this war. We need to use the resources in the pipeline to end the war and start setting up the instruments and the infrastructure, the system, curtailing the war and bringing our young men and young women home. Dr. King gave a speech in front of the Riverside Church Beyond Vietnam, where he connected civil rights struggle here at home with the Vietnam War. Do you see a connection with what's happening today with the Jena 6, this resurgence of a civil rights movement here in the United States, and the fact that there is this vibrant anti-war movement and a war that is very unpopular here at home? Do you see a connection with that the same way as Dr. King did in '68? I clearly do see a connection between what Dr. King saw during that period when he spoke out against the war in Vietnam. And I might say I think that was one of his greatest speeches, really. When he said that night at the Riverside Church that America was the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. And he went on, so to say, that the bombs we dropped in Vietnam, those same bombs would be shattered here in America. And what we're doing today in Iraq will be felt in the streets, the villages, hamlets, towns of our cities and countryside. I think it's impossible to separate the two. And if Dr. King could speak to us today, he would also be condemning the action of our government in Iraq. He would say that's a better way. You know, recently I heard the Dalai Lama speak in Atlanta, and he spoke of the fact that a powerful country as America, maybe it shouldn't send more bombs and missiles and guns around the world, but maybe we should send Peace Corps volunteers. I think we have to come to that point and say that war is obsolete and it cannot be used as a tool of our foreign policy. War is not the answer. My fear is that if we continue on this plane and on this road that we're on, history will not be kind to us as a nation and as a people. That the people in the Middle East, the young people growing up there, will grow up hating our children and our grandchildren because of what we're doing. Someplace along the way, somebody, or some group, or maybe a new president, maybe it's someone in the academic community, somebody, some religious leader, but somebody or some group, some force must say that we must come to our senses before we lose our way, before we lose our sense of purpose, before we lose our sense of direction. And as Gandhi said on one occasion, it is nonviolence or non-existence. And Dr. King put it another way. We must learn to live together as brothers and sisters, or we will perish as fools. With the war in Iraq now in its 5th year, Dr. King's famous speech at the Riverside Church seems more relevant than ever. From Washington, D.C., this has been Geoff Millard reporting for Truthout.org.